In today's episode, I have the privilege of sitting down with Brian Levenson. Now, Brian is the founder of Strong Skills, where he provides executive coaching and mental performance coaching, speaking, and consulting to elite organizations, performers, and leaders. In addition, Brian also hosts his own podcast called Intentional Performers, where he has interviewed over 340 elite performers over the years. Our focus today, though, is actually on Brian's book, Shift Your Mind, 9 Mental Skills in Preparation and Performance. In our conversation, we'll dive into the difference between our preparation and performance mind. We break down some of Brian's 9 mental shifts and knowing when and how we as coaches can create better environments for both ourselves and our athletes where we can thrive in both preparation and performance. This is such a great conversation, and I know you'll have a lot of great takeaways. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Brian Levenson. Brian Levenson, welcome to the Being Champions podcast, man.
Thanks, Matt. Excited to be here. And you sent me a really nice note when I discontinued my podcast. So good on you that you've gotten started and you're getting going, and excited to be on the podcast with you.
I'm actually so glad you brought that up, Brian, because I was listening to that last episode, Goodbye for Now, Grateful Forever, on your intentional performers. And you brought up like a really cool point, man, where you're talking about when you started your journey, it was like you made this big list and it was all these people that you looked up to, and you're hoping to connect with and learn from them. And now they're your colleagues and they're your friends. And with me starting my journey, it was the same thing, like making my list and, putting you on that list, like someone I've looked up to and learned from over the years. I'm just thrilled to have you on this show, man. And I appreciate you spending some time with me.
Oh, it means a ton. I know how hard it is to get going. It's harder to keep going. Yeah. And then actually it was really hard to stop. And so all of those are true, but getting started, a lot of people just don't take the leap. And it's, people say humbling. I guess I don't have a better word for it, but yeah, it's weird to hear someone say, "Oh, I put you on a list of someone I'd want to talk to." Because when I started it, I definitely created a list and checked it twice. And then it was mind-boggling that there were people on that list that would come into my life in one way, shape, or form, whether like I was in a Starbucks one day and Paul Rabel walked in, and Paul's one of the best lacrosse players ever, but he's also just a really unique, interesting guy. Or someone would say to me, "Hey, would you want to talk to David Epstein?" So I remember like Dan Pink said, "Hey, would you want to connect with David Epstein?" I was like, "Yeah, I love the sports gene." And then range. So I give that background just to say it's one of the most fulfilling and coolest parts of the podcast is, I was telling someone this earlier today, you get to create your own masterclass and you get to reach out to people with an offering that is different than "I want to pick your brain" or "I want to grab a cup of coffee." Hopefully it can add some value to them in some way. And for some of my guests, I think it added more value to them. But it really created an opportunity to build relationships with people, and that's what made it so fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And Brian, before we jump into your book and our conversation around that, can you share to our listeners a little bit about your background in mental performance? And I know you've made this shift now more going into executive coaching. So share with our listeners a little bit about your journey and your story, and then we'll jump into your book.
I'll try to give it as quickly as I can. And, when I first started my podcast, I used to ask people for their story and their journey. And what I learned in doing that is that everybody's got their own unique journey and story. And I actually, for me, have figured out, like, me giving advice based on my journey is kind of irrelevant, in the sense that we're all like an N of one. And we all experience the world through our own set of eyes and our own brain. So it's an interesting perspective that I think I've gleaned from the podcast around journeys and stories. But the quick skinny of it, I was a lost puppy out of college, didn't know what I wanted to do for a living. Actually didn't have a job after I went to a private university for college. And a woman came into my life named Julie Ellian. And Julie at the time was working as a mental performance coach with some of the best athletes in the world, especially in the golf world. And Julie took me to a cheesecake factory and sat me down and told me what she did and saw something in me that I don't think I saw in myself or that anyone really saw in me at the time. And so she introduced me to the world of sports psychology, helped me figure out where to go to grad school. I got my master's in sports psychology, and then hit the ground running and worked a little bit with Julie. She mentored me, helped me get my business going. Big part of my journey is Julie. I think a lot of people get started and they're completely on their own and it's scary and daunting.
Yeah.
I always had Julie to support me, which made it a privileged situation for me for sure. And then I would say, early on, I was working with, it could be a 12-year-old golfer and an NBA player. And so it was pretty diverse in the type of athletes that I was working with. And then I started working with sports teams and organizations, high school, college, and pro. And along the way, people started reaching out and saying, "Hey, I played a Division I sport, or I coach a sports team, or I play sports, at an amateur level, but I'm also in business."
Yeah.
And so I started working with those people and loved it so much so that I went back to school again to Georgetown to study executive coaching. And then fast forward today, pretty much my business is one-on-one executive coaching. I also do offsites, retreats, facilitation, speaking, that sort of stuff. But the core and the crux of my work is working with executives. There are some still in the sports world. So I'll work with, head coaches and I'll work with front office personnel, but it's mainly people that are in leadership positions and I work with them and I love it. I really enjoy it. And actually am no longer, I just had a call with someone who said, "Hey, would you work with me as an athlete?" And I refer to other people for that now and love the work that I do.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And when I hear you talk, Brian, and this is kind of the reason in my mission starting this podcast is recognizing coaches, we need coaches too, right? And we're always challenging our athletes and we're always telling them that we need to get better in the offseason. We need to do this. We need to do X, Y, and Z. But really, at the end of the day, we need coaching too. We need to get pushed. We have to understand some of our blind spots and how we can get better as coaches. And we need people in our life to pull that out of us. So that's really why, Brian, I wanted to talk to you today about your book and Shift Your Mind and your 9 mental shifts to thrive in preparation and performance. Just to kind of kick it off on this conversation, Brian, what really inspired you to write this book? And as you're writing that book, I know you kind of came up through your research and interviews, there was 3 specific criteria that kept popping up. So can you talk about what inspired you to write this book and what did you find in your research?
Yeah, I think the inspiration was just working with athletes and I was hearing and seeing and noticing this theme where I'd work with an athlete and their preparation mind was what it was. And then I'd ask them about their competitive mind or their performance mind, and it'd be very different. Yeah. And I think we often say practice as if you're performing and we hear lines and we hear mantras. But what I was hearing from a lot of my clients at the time, regardless of the sport they were playing, regardless of the level, is that their best mindsets in preparation were actually very different than their best mindsets in performance.
Yeah.
And so, we talk about humble and arrogant for a minute, they would need to be really about learning and growing and developing and open to feedback and be really humble in preparation. But when they got between the lines, they needed this unshakable belief in themselves that they could execute on what they had prepared. So that was just showing up over and over again with my clients. And then you mentioned research. Then I would start watching documentaries or listening to podcasts or reading books. And I would see this framework over and over again. And no one had really named it or put their finger on it. Tom Coughlin was the closest where he said, you need to be humble enough to prepare and confident enough to perform. When I read that, I was like, oh, that's it. And then when I did a deeper dive into it, I thought it was something a little more than that, which is there's different mindsets that we need depending on what we're doing. And sometimes we need multiple mindsets. And then you mentioned the 3 elements. To me, it's preparation, performance, and then there's practice. And we do want to practice our performance mind and we want to practice our preparation mind. So sports actually gets a lot of things wrong, I find, in the world. But one of the things I think it think it really gets right is the idea of practice. And I think a lot of other industries could learn a lot from sports when it comes to practicing for performance and also practicing for preparation. So, yeah, I try to make a distinction between all of those and use these other shifts that we called them in the book. They're all distinctions that I think are important for people to acknowledge and to think about and hopefully to practice.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, Brian, this is a great segue to kind of dive into some of your shifts. So you do have nine, and I'm hoping today maybe we'll dive through like the first five. And I'm big, and I talk to coaches a lot, and I try to challenge them to recognize that as coaches, we're the ones that actually create the environment and the experience. And one thing I try to tell them, like everything kind of starts with us as coaches. It's not about us, but it starts with us. So thinking about your nine shifts and talking about this first one, humble and arrogant, how do we as coaches kind of work through this mindset? And then how can we actually recognize it within our environment and make sure our athletes are able to experience this shift? And then, I mean, the big thing I notice is we oftentimes spend too much time in the preparation mode. So how do we build in some type of more performance mode within our environment?
Yeah, so I'll come back to the prep and performance
Okay.
mode, maybe second.
All right.
So the first part of the question is really around coaches and
Yeah.
how do coaches think about shift your mind. So I didn't write the book for coaches. I really wrote it for performers, for the
Yeah.
people that are executing and performing. But if you're a coach, you're trying, as you said, you're trying to create the environment
Yeah.
that gives your athletes the best opportunity to execute and perform. So I like to think of performance and greatness in performance in three different buckets.
Okay.
And this is going away from the book for a minute, but I think you have mindset, which is really what the book is about,
Mm.
and what we're going to talk a lot about today. But then there's culture,
Yeah.
and then there's leadership. And I like to make distinctions between those three. And I think the best organizations in the world are filled with people with a mindset that allows them to unlock their potential.
Yeah.
They create a culture that gives them the best opportunity to bring their mindset into the performance
Yeah.
and preparation. And then there's leadership that influences and impacts the mindset and the culture. So they kind of impact each other. The
Mhm.
culture is going to impact the leadership of the mindset. The mindset's going to impact the leadership of the culture. The leadership's going to impact the mindset and the culture. So for me, that at least has become pretty clear. And sometimes we don't use that language to really have clarity around what the heck we do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
by the way, you mentioned coaching coaches. Like I have a coach because I want to develop my mindset. I want to make sure
Right.
I'm showing up as the leader I want to be. I want to make sure that places that I'm impacting, that I'm being intentional with the culture that I'm showing up with. So I'm a big believer in that. So I just wanted to put that in first
Yeah.
because I think it does impact how you think about shift your mind and how you implement it. So I think the mindset development needs to be intentional from a coach's standpoint. The amount of sports coaches that have said to me, well, I like the psychology stuff. I want to do that.
Yeah.
And I would say to them, that's great. You should be doing that. And that shouldn't also stop you from hiring a mental performance coach. We should
Mhm.
be in tandem. We should be in lockstep and we should be collaborative in the conditions that you're trying to create, the culture, the leadership, and the mindset you're trying to build. So I think for coaches, it's really important that they understand that they need to have a collective mindset, a collective culture, a collective leadership principles or philosophy. And if they're coaching a team, it's a collection of individuals.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the hard parts of coaching is how do you treat everyone differently while holding them all accountable? And how do you understand who they are and what their needs are? And one of the reasons I have 9 shifts is to say, one of these might not resonate with you.
Yeah.
It may not be appropriate for your sport. So arrogance, for example, for a fighter pilot or for, someone who is in certain situations might not actually be what they need.
Mhm.
And so you could be in a negotiation and arrogance could actually not be what you need. That might be a situation where you need to listen and learn and be selfless. My point being is that there's 9 shifts in the book, but I came up with like 35 shifts.
Right.
There were shifts that didn't even make it into the book. And so the biggest thing I would say as it relates to my book for a coach is to think about what does your team need from a preparation and performance standpoint as a
Mhm.
collective, and then also spend time with each individual to really find out what their ideal mindset is when they're preparing and what's their ideal mindset when they're performing. High school kids are tough because they're
Yeah.
still learning it. They haven't necessarily figured it out. But if you can unlock for them and have them be aware of what they look like when they're at their best in preparation and what they look like when they're at their best in performance, man, oh man, it can create clarity for them. And that clarity can free them up to learn and then execute as well.
Yeah, I love it. So Brian, thinking about that first shift, humble and arrogant, and I thought of you because I just heard Matt Barnes was on a podcast and he was talking about JJ Redick, and he was like, JJ sometimes comes across as arrogant on the court when he's coaching now. If you see him with the Lakers now, and it's one of those, no, he's not arrogant because during preparation, that man works so hard on every single detail and he's humble in there. So can you talk about that shift first as far as being that humble person in preparation and then shifting into being that arrogant? And why did you use that word arrogant over confidence?
I've actually met JJ before in like a social setting, and I'm from Maryland, so I
Yeah.
grew up with Maryland Duke. And if you grow up in Maryland when you're my age, you just don't like Duke. That's kind
Yeah.
of the way you're
Yeah.
brought
Yeah.
up. And so we had a fun conversation. But I actually think he's a really interesting example because when he was at Duke, he had a target on his back, and everyone seemed to not like Duke and not like JJ. And then he gets the NBA and he's told he can't do this and he can't do that. And he had a wonderful career. I think,
Yeah.
played for 15 years probably. He was wonderful on TV and he seems to know what he's doing as a coach. I want to really make sure that this is clear. Arrogance alone is potentially toxic and devastating.
Yeah.
But when you pair it with humility, and you can hold both of those. So the arrogance piece and why I went to it is when I realized what it was the best performers in the world. They are so humble in their preparation, willing to get feedback, willing to learn, willing to grow, having a modest or low estimate of their own importance, and not even thinking that they're anything. Like they are so willing to sort of break themselves down, to grow, to learn, to develop, that when it's time to perform, they've earned the right to have an unshakable belief in their capacity and their ability. And I could have said confidence, and
Mhm.
people probably would accept that more than the arrogance piece because we've all had an arrogant boss or had an
Right.
arrogant player who wasn't what they should be and it backfired. But the point of the book is to pair the preparation mind with the performance mind,
Yeah.
that you earn the performance mind through the preparation mind. And as you study JJ or Kobe or Jordan or whoever you want to study, they have that unshakable belief in themselves. Like Stephen Curry to me is one of the most fascinating ones. He earns the right to shoot the ball from, half court. Like
Yeah.
he's earned it.
Yeah.
And before he started doing that, no one did that. Damian Lillard didn't do that. Like
Mhm.
now he does. We see, Trey Young do that. So you see all these basketball players, they earn the right. But if he hadn't earned it through humility and preparation, and he hadn't proved his competence and his ability to do that, he shouldn't do it, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
arrogance
Yeah.
without all of that work is stupid. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really important that it's arrogance. And for me, confidence is it takes great confidence to be humble.
Yeah.
It takes
True.
great confidence to be arrogant. And what I found with a lot of the clients I worked with is they didn't actually have the confidence, the cojones to step into arrogance.
Yeah.
They would rather play it safe and be humble because they're not going to get burned. They're not going to be vulnerable. They're not going to get cut. And so instead, it's a lot easier to just play it safe, stay humble, stay meek, and not actually go for it. And the last thing I'll say is arrogance doesn't have to be outward. I think
Right.
Curry is such a good example. It can be inner. It can be inner arrogance. It can be just this unshakable belief you have in yourself. You miss your first 10 shots and you're a 40% three-point shooter. You're shooting the 11th.
Yeah.
But a lot of us don't understand that. They'll say, oh, you're having an off day. Stop. Don't keep doing it. But the ones that have earned it know that the next one's going in, and that's an arrogance. Even the people that change the world and disrupt the world from a business standpoint, how many people tell them their idea won't work? It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's redundant, or, you're not the right person. You need to have that unshakable belief if you want to do something great. So when I'm studying greatness, I just see it over and over again in sports, but also in other industries as well.
Yeah, I love it. And actually, Brian, I wanted to share this. As soon as I read your book, I had I'm a track and field coach as well as strength and conditioning, and I had an athlete, and she was that person. Like she just had to realize it. So I kind of I played off of your stuff, and we did it more as like an alter ego. I'm like, hey, listen, when you show up to the track meet, I need this person to show up and just recognize when you step on the track, you are the best person out there because of all the work you did. So literally right before competition, I would look at her, I'm like, hey, is so and so here? And she's like, yeah, that ego's here. So she was ready to go. So that's how I kind of used it was with our high school athlete was using it kind of like this alter ego. Like, hey, during practice, you're gonna be this person, but during competition, I need this person to show up.
I was just listening to a podcast with Michael Gervais, and he
Yeah.
was being, and I think like I didn't, my podcast doesn't exist without Mike's podcast.
Yeah.
His podcast was the reason I fired mine up. I listened to his podcast. I loved it. I learned a ton from it. I was fortunate to have him on my podcast. He's someone I still email with and consider to be a mentor, even from afar.
Yeah.
Just watching the way he operates and the way he works. And on this podcast, he was being critical of the idea of an alter ego. And what he was suggesting is to get more in tune with what your values are and who
Yeah.
you
Okay.
are authentic, who you genuinely are yourself.
Yeah.
And he was sort of talking about the dangers of getting into an alter ego. And I think he was making some very valid points. And one of the mistakes I think we make is to think that authenticity is rigid.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not. We have all these different sides of ourselves,
Yeah.
and we all have humility and arrogance inside of us. We do.
Yeah.
Like we all have an ego inside of us. We all have self-doubt. We have, the two different people on our shoulder, one telling us we suck and the other one telling us we're the greatest.
Yeah.
And we have to learn how to cultivate the right one at the right time.
Yeah.
And so I believe it is authentic for her. I think you said it was a
Yeah,
her.
it was a female.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like as long as it is still genuine for her to cultivate that alter ego for performance and she believes in it and it's true to her, I think you can combine what Mike Gervais was saying
Yeah.
and know that, yeah, that's how I see myself. But I do see myself differently when I'm in the arena versus when I'm out of it.
Yeah.
I actually think it can be liberating for a lot of people that when I'm in the arena, I'm going to step into something different and I'm going to bring out a different side of myself. Beyonce is one of my favorite people to study
Yeah.
because she's so quiet and soft spoken. And if you hear her interviewed, like you would not guess that she's this diva who gets on, in an arena and just shuts the place down with this swagger and arrogance and like they're just total badassery that she
Yeah.
brings to her shows.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of examples, but I think of her as when she's in preparation, if you study her, she is humble, she's learning, she's growing, she's constantly perfecting, which is another shift that we talk about.
Yeah.
But when she gets on stage, she's gonna just shut it down and do whatever it takes to make the show happen, to be the best. And too often we hold ourselves back or we rob ourselves of bringing out another version of us because we're afraid of how others will view us.
Yeah, I love it. When you heard you said that word rugged, I thought of Brad Stolberg and his book Master of Change, where he talks about rugged flexibility, right? And being rugged in the values, but still being flexible enough. And I think that transitions nicely, Brian, to your shift, perfectionist and adaptable. And again, it's almost perfectionist is almost like that word arrogance. Sometimes people get nervous to use perfect or being a perfectionist, but I know listening to interviews you've done, like you found different levels of being a perfectionist and talking about high self-oriented or adaptive versus maladaptive. So could you dive into that shift, the perfectionist versus being adaptable?
Yeah, I love that you bring up Brad. I think his work's great.
Yeah.
Peak Performance, which you wrote with Steve Magnus, where they talk about stress plus rest equaling growth.
Yeah.
You could even put into like there's binaries there, right? There's the stress and there's rest. And when do we stress and when do we rest? And really at the core of my book is this idea of when. and that we don't spend enough time thinking about when. We think a lot about why and how and what. And we even think about like when, as far as Dan Pink's book, which talks about the time of day that you should execute on things. But we don't think about when we should show up this way and when we should show up that way. And that it is authentic for me to think about, when do I need to be this way and when do I need to be that way? And that it's not being disingenuous to do it. So perfectionistic and adaptable is a really good example of that. We so often say, don't try to be perfect. Perfectionism is bad. It gets in the way. It's debilitative. It can be if you're perfectionistic all the time. Just like if you're humble all the time, just like if you're arrogant all the time, or just like if you're adaptable all the time. So the key here is to know when to be perfectionistic and when to let go of it. And so in preparation, we want to be perfectionistic. We want to have this high demand of standards and excellence, and not hold back and hold ourselves accountable to what we can do to be as great as we possibly can be. I used to interview players at the NBA Combine for an NBA team. I did it for a number of years. The amount of them that said that they were perfectionistic was through the roof. It's very hard to play at the highest level in any sport without a level of perfectionism. The issue, of course, becomes when they bring the perfectionism into the performance. And now it's like, oh, they, are so perfectionistic that they don't make the pass, or they don't recover after missing their first 3 shots, or they thought the other team was going to play man and they're in a 2-3 zone. I use a lot of basketball analogies, so
I'm a big hoops guy, so
that's the language I would use. But we can even talk track and field, right? One of my favorite videos of all time was with a woman named Heather Dorniden, who now is Heather Kampf, who fell in the Big Ten championship. And she had perfected everything up until that point, falls on her face hard. Everyone's running ahead, and she gets up, adapts, adjusts, and just flies and ran one of her best races she's ever run, and won the race. So if we're perfectionistic in that moment, we probably shut down and say, this didn't go how I envisioned it and planned it. But if we're adaptable, we know how to handle it. Michael Phelps used to prep himself for his goggles to fall off when he practiced, right? So that he was practicing his performance mind of being adaptable and still swimming at what he was capable of, even with his goggles falling off. So that's the practicing of the performance mind that I mean, is that Phelps is a good example. He also did a lot of visualization and preparation so that he can be present in performance. But he's a good example too of someone who was perfectionistic in his preparation and then practiced the adaptability so that when he got in the pool, no matter what happened, he could adapt to his surroundings and the environment.
Yeah, I love that. And another track and field story, Ashton Eaton, he called it bulletproofing, where he would go through every single worst case scenario going through the decathlon. So again, it's one of those, like, you plan for that moment. I remember that story about Michael Phelps, and that did happen to him in the Olympic Games, where he was swimming and his goggles fell off, and he still swam to a gold medal. So it's one of those, being adaptable, because sports is an unpredictable environment. You never know what's going to happen. But again, like you said, being able to perfect in preparation, but then better prepare for these situations that show up where it is an unpredictable landscape.
Yeah, you said it's unpredictable. That's the beauty of sports. It's wicked. David Epstein talks about wicked environments in his book Range, and the idea of sports is that you don't know what's going to happen. That's why we love them. It's one of the few beacons of unknowns that still exists in our society. And so we just don't know what's going to transpire. And so if you try to be perfectionistic in your performance, you're not going to be able to handle the unknown or the challenges that occur. And so, I love the idea of agility. I love the idea of flexibility when we're performing. And there's a lot of different examples of that. I talk about my wedding day, where we did a wedding outside, and we didn't even care about having an outdoor wedding, but where we were getting married, they had a beautiful courtyard. So we said, oh, it's nice out. Let's just do it outside. And there didn't look like there was going to be any rain, and it was summer in Washington, D.C., and in came a rainstorm, and everybody adjusted and adapted, and we got done with the ceremony and adapted and pushed it back a little bit and made it happen. And then everybody got inside, and then it started downpouring. But, the amount of time and energy we tried to perfect that day and spend time on seating charts and the music that would be played, and you try to perfect everything, the food, and then the day comes and you just gotta roll with it and be
Yeah.
adaptable
Yeah.
because you don't know if a storm's coming. And, I've been to weddings where the power went off. I've been to weddings where, someone doesn't show or something bad happens. I've been to weddings with health issues. The father or the bride
Yeah.
had a heart attack. Like they've all happened. And so you perfect, perfect, perfect. But if you can't be adaptable, it's going to be a tough go for you.
Yeah, yeah, and as I hear you talk, Ryan, I was just thinking about these two shifts. I kind of wanted to combine them together. Your analysis and instinct, and the work and play. And so thinking about that last shift where you're talking about us being a perfectionist and making sure we're able to shift out of that where we're okay with making mistakes, we're able to be flexible, we're able to adapt. But what about this whole concept with the analysis and work? I feel like as coaches, sometimes we overanalyze and we fall into the trap of paralysis by analysis, or we're always in that work mode where it's never enough. I got to study more film. I got to do this. I got to get to the office at 5 a.m. I'm going to sleep on the couch tonight. How do we let go of that and then go more to this instinct and play and let joy actually show up because we're playing a sport or we're coaching a sport, like something that is fun. So talk to us about those two shifts.
Yeah, we live in a world now where there's so much data and
Yeah.
analytics and information, and it really helps us. It
Mhm.
allows us to know everything about our opponent or about our sweet spots. That detailed examination of the elements or the structure of something typically is helpful, and we should interpret that, and we should discuss the numbers and the analysis, and we should use that discussion and that preparation to then rely on our intuition and our instinct when we are, under the fire, so to speak, because if we're not using sort of our natural innate impulse, we're missing on an opportunity to play off of feel or
Yeah.
to notice something that maybe didn't show up in the analytics, and observe and make things happen. So, I mean, I've seen it happen so many times in sports where at some point someone needs to tap into something beyond the numbers and get into intuition. And so once again, we have a society that says, "Oh, are you analytics or gut?" I reject the binary, right? Like I
Yeah.
think it's both. It's an and we need to have the analytics and the analysis, and then we need to know when to tap into intuition. And once again, if life was just about analysis, then we would all just be robots. But we all know that greatness often and genius often happens from art, from instinct, from something that science might not be able to always share and show. Sometimes it can. And that's
Yeah.
why analysis is really big after a game or after an event or an experience. Go back and analyze it. And maybe there is logic there. Work and play are some of my favorites.
Yeah.
There was a basketball coach I worked with who, at the end, before he broke the huddle for the team to go out and play their game, at the end of his speech, he'd always say, "Play with joy."
Yeah.
That would be the last thing he says to his guys. And I worked with an NBA player once, and this guy played in the league for 15 plus years, successful player. And we would text, and I would just, joy would be the text.
Yeah.
And I think especially with pro athletes, people forget that it does become a job, that it does become work, and they don't get to that level without it being work in
Yeah.
preparation. But if they try to work it when they're performing and they lose the idea that we play sports and that it's supposed to actually be something that's kind of childish,
Yeah.
like I love the idea of like prep like an adult but play like a kid.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
it's similar to the work and play concept that I used here. And I just think whenever we're performing, if we forget to smile or we forget, not even smile, because some people want to be more intense, but we
Yeah.
forget to have the joy inside of us. Like Kevin Garnett probably got a lot of joy out of being intense. That
Yeah.
was his way.
Yeah.
But he played with joy and passion, and you could see it. So it doesn't have to be smiling, but it does have to be joyful.
Yeah, and thinking of that word joy, I think of Steve Kerr, and I think that's one of their values that he's built into the Golden State Warriors. And when you watch the Warriors, like they are having an absolute ball because they recognize like, hey, we're playing basketball. And Steve always talks about, hey, if joy doesn't show up in our environment, I did a bad job as a coach.
But
So
they're a fascinating one, right? Because Draymond's been there forever,
right,
and how Draymond defines joy is probably very different than how Clay and Steph did, which goes back to that original point of for coaches to really think about what am I trying to do with each individual and what are we trying to do as a collective?
yeah,
And obviously, if the individual is is getting in the way of the collective values, then that's a decision you need to think about and you need to assess for. But I think it's a really interesting example because there's an individual maybe in how they operate and how they work, and then there's the team component. And I don't claim to know enough about Draymond, and I've never met him and spent any time with him, but he's always been an interesting piece to that puzzle for a team that had just so much success for so long.
Yeah, yeah, and I heard earlier you used the word science, and one of your shifts is talking about experimenting and trusting the process. And I like to tell coaches, man, I like to think like a scientist, where we do many experiments every single day. So I was wondering if we could transition into that one, experimenting and trusting the process. And one thing I wanted to see if you could touch upon was this whole idea, especially from the coaching landscape. Sometimes we do have this imposter syndrome show up as leaders. So how do we go from experimenting to actually trusting ourselves and letting go into performance?
Yeah, I talk about stand-up comedy in this shift a lot. So I talk
Yeah.
about Chris Rock and Jerry Seinfeld. Chris Rock, especially, he would just experiment with new material at a small comedy club, I think in New Jersey, and just testing his material over and over and over again, especially when he knew he had an HBO special coming up.
Yeah.
And so I love that example because stand-up comedians to me are like the ultimate performers. They're live. There's an audience that gives them immediate feedback. They've prepped it, and now they need to find a way to trust in their material.
Yeah.
And so I think they go hand in hand. If you experiment, you try something, you test it out, you try to discover, like for Chris Rock, he's trying to discover if something's funny or what the tone needs to be, or what the language is that he needs to use or what imagery he needs to present so that then he can trust that he's done the work.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't know how the audience is going to react, but he wants to test it as much as possible so he can trust in that process when it's time to get on stage. I think to the imposter syndrome, if you've never felt like an imposter, I don't know what you're doing in your life.
Right.
And so, like, I always think about imposter as being a privilege. It's like, oh, I am in this seat. How lucky am I? How grateful am I that I'm being challenged in this way? And I need to trust that I'll figure it out. And I need to trust that I've prepped for this. And there are times where I haven't prepped, by the way, and I'm thrown into a situation. And let's just say, use basketball again, the head coach gets thrown out. And now the assistant coach is now the head coach, and maybe they weren't expecting it, and they need to go back to that idea of like, they have a resolve or a belief in themselves so they can figure it out. And that's the trusting process, is this belief in this resolve, even this grit or this ability to recover and find a way. Psychological safety plays a role in this as well, as you think about the organization and the idea that, hey, am I in a position to take a risk? What happens if I fail? Will I be embarrassed? How do I really tap into this notion of like, hey, I'm going to take a risk, and what's the worst case scenario? And so if I trust that I'm going to do the process, and then if I fail, I'll come back to the drawing board and figure it out, I think can be really healthy and helpful for a coach.
Yeah, I love that. And I've never heard thinking of imposter syndrome as a privilege. So talk about a new shift for me to look at things. So I love that. And that's something I'm going to use all the time. But Brian, we're kind of running short on time. So I wanted to ask you one last question. And I know with your podcast, you've interviewed like over 340 expert intentional performers. So I wanted you to wrap up, like, what were some of the greatest lessons you've learned from those performers and some takeaways you can give our listeners as coaches and how we can help our athletes further thrive in any environment?
When I started the podcast, it was called Beyond the Surface.
Yeah.
And the idea was to go beyond the surface with people. And about 30 episodes in, I was looking at it and I was trying to answer the question that you're asking. And I noticed that the people that I was interviewing were all intentional. Mm-hmm. And they would put something in their wallet as a reminder, or they would, wake up in the morning and either pray or say something that they were grateful for. Or like there was one athlete I had on, she spray painted her wall after going through an injury and said, there's no quit in me. And so that to me is probably the biggest takeaway, is that the people I interviewed were really intentional about what success meant to them. They were really intentional about what they wanted.
Yeah.
And then they were intentional about the actions and the behavior and the conditions that they would put themselves in to try to give themselves the best opportunity for success. So that's the name of the podcast. Intentional Performers came from them, not from me. And then I'd also say that they're imperfect. That I've had people on there that have gotten into issues. I'll call them issues. There are people that I've had on that have been fired. There are people that I've had on that I really disagree with how they see the world. There are people that have come on that have gotten divorced. There are people that have come on that have been fired. So even with all of these people that I look up to and I consider to be role models to a certain extent, they're human and
Yeah.
they have imperfections just like all of us. And I think it's important to remember that whenever we're consuming people's information, is that they have blind spots, they have dark sides, and they have imperfections in them. And so I hope anyone that's listening to this knows that about me, is that I'm doing the best I can, but I have bad moments and good moments. I have bad things that I don't handle the way that I should. And then hopefully some moments where I shine. And I think over the course of the last 30 to 40 minutes, I'm sure I've had moments that, a year from now, I'd listen to this and say, yeah, I would disagree with me on that. Yeah. And so there's some acceptance of the imperfections that I think are helpful. And then just bringing it back to my book, that doesn't mean I still can't strive to be better and try to make those imperfections less of an issue for me. But I think that's something that I'm taking with me, is that a lot of these people seemed like they had everything going on. And then when I look underneath the hood or follow them or talk to them or develop relationships with them, we all have our own stuff going on. And I think that's a big piece of my takeaway as well.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, Brian. And I think about, it's really about how we show up every day and who we're being and who we get to become on this journey, man. So I love how you bring up the whole idea of just being intentional and who we want to be, how we're showing up, and like I said, who we get to become on this journey. So, Brian, I can't thank you enough for being on today. If our listeners wanted to connect with you, I know you love connecting with people. How can they? What's your social media best way to connect with you?
Yeah, I haven't been that active on Twitter or X in a while. I used to love it. I used to be really active, and no reason in particular. I just found it not to be as energizing and maybe more draining. So LinkedIn is the place that I actually have really enjoyed and find myself going to often. So you can connect with me there at Brian Levenson. And the podcast, I'm leaving all the episodes up. It's called Intentional Performers. There's 399 episodes that you can take a deep dive into. And so LinkedIn's probably the best place. My website's strongskills.co. So you can find my contact information there as well. And Matt, congrats on getting this thing started. You've already had some amazing guests, people that I've had on my podcast or people that I respect immensely. And I think you're barking up a great tree. And I don't know if I'm a champion, but I'm going to keep working on becoming one. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here and sharing some of the things I've learned along my way.
Yeah, and I can't thank you enough, Brian. Again, when I made my list, I really wanted to connect with you. And after talking with you, I know why I wanted to connect with you. So I appreciate you. I'm glad you're in my circle, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation today with Brian Levenson. I think the challenge for us as coaches is to take a hard look at our environment. And like Brian said, are we putting ourselves in the right state of mind at the right time and understanding when we need to be in the preparation mind versus when we need to be in the performance mind? And I think that really starts with us as coaches and recognizing our own shifts and recognizing where we are in our mental state going into a preparation or going into performance. And then we have to create an environment where we challenge our kids and challenge our athletes to go through these shifts and understand when to be in this preparation mind and when to be in the performance mind. Because at the end of the day, we want to thrive in both environments. But again, it starts with us as coaches. So take a hard look at your environment and understand how we can develop both the preparation and the performance mind. So with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in again for another episode with the Being Champions podcast, and hope you tune in next week. Thanks.